So far, we've looked at a lot of the internal workings of the way that Wise sets up and controls various audio assets. However, none of this really is very useful to us until we can trigger those assets in the game, and that's what events are for. So let's pop over to the Events tab and start looking at this section of Wise setup. So for starters, let's create a new work unit as usual, and I'm just going to call it Demo Events. So in this work unit, we can start creating events, which the game engine in turn will be able to trigger in-game and therefore actually play the sounds that we've been designing. So for a good sense of how this works, for starters, we're just going to create a simple event. Let's call it Big Door. And in here, we now have event actions, and we can just pop back over to audio. And you'll notice that even though I'm selecting the audio tab, I still have that event over here in my event editor. So as long as we don't click and let go of one of these objects, if we do that, we will lose that event. But so long as we have it selected, we can click and drag one of our in-game objects, in this case, the top level blend container for Big Door, and it will automatically populate as a play action. So when the game triggers this event, it will play the Big Door sound. Very straightforward. This is how you can start triggering a lot of your simple sounds in the game. But events are not limited to just triggering audio. There's actually a lot of different things that events can do, which you can start exploring just by opening this drop-down menu. You can see that there's a lot of different things that you can trigger using an event. So let's say that in this game that we're designing for, the player can manually change the radio station by dialing a physical dial in the game, or they can use a keyboard shortcut just to change stations. So for that, we're going to want to create a new event, and let's call it Select Casual. Now, if you recall, the casual radio station was the 0 side of the game parameter. So we go over to Game Parameter, Set Game Parameter, then we can pop over to the Game Syncs tab, select our radio game sync, and pop it into the missing object. So now we are setting the game parameter for the radio game sync object, and we'll want it to set to 0, because if we take a look again at our radio event, 0 is the casual station and the Latin beat is at 100. So coming back over to our event, selecting the casual station involves setting the game parameter radio to 0. Let's see what happens if we actually do that. We'll make sure that casual is decoded. That's what it sounds like if it's manually selected, but if it's automatically set to 0, you'll notice that there is no slew at all. We don't hear the static in the middle. It just pops over, and that's not very realistic. Let's say we want to give the player that realistic sound, even if they're just using a keyboard shortcut to change the station. So the best way to do that is if you look at the Events tab, we actually have some controls for the event down here. We can delay when the event triggers. We can also set a fade-in time, and this is what we want. In this case, this fade-in time would act like a slew rate. It would mean that the shift from 100, or whatever the current value is, to 0 would take this much time to activate. And you can even set the curve that you want for that. For now, a standard crossfade curve is perfect, and we're going to set this fade-in time to 1. Now, one more thing to note in our basic events controls is that you also have a bypass game parameter interpolation checkbox. This is for if you have game interpolation, such as the slew rate that we've set up on some of our objects, and maybe in one particular event you've created, you don't want to be using that slew rate that you created on the game sync level. You want to bypass it and set up a custom value here in the Set Game Parameters box. So you can do that just by checking this box, and then it will ignore any slew rate that you've created so far. Now, we can't test this the way that we tested it before by just typing in the value here, because then we would be bypassing the event. So in order to properly test our event and make sure that it's set up the way we want it to and is acting the way we want it to, we need to do something else. We actually need to create an event to play the radio in the first place. So let's start with that. So we'll just click and drag the radio object into there for a play event. And now there's something else we need to do. This is where I'd like to introduce you to the Sessions tab. So let's just pop over here, select Sessions, and you'll see Soundcaster Sessions. This is extremely useful for testing your event structure in Wise without having to connect to the game itself. So for now, let's just use the default work unit, and we're going to create a new Soundcaster session, and we're going to call it Test Radio. Now double-click to open it. And here we have a workbox that will essentially let you test out all of the controls and setups that you've created in Wwise, just to make sure that when the game triggers them, they're acting as designed. So now go back to the Events tab and click and drag the Play Radio event and the Select Casual event into this Soundcaster session. Now if we trigger the Play Radio event and the Select Casual event, that's exactly what we were going for. Perfect. Now, just a word of warning. What happens if you hit Play Radio again? You're going to hear that casual because you've changed the parameter value. If you want to be able to test from scratch, you always have to make sure to select Reset All between your tests.